Luke's Gospel, chapter 8. I'm going to read verses 40 to 48. And I need to set this up and tell you in advance that Jesus has just been in the region known as the Gatorines, and he has just released a man of many devils. And then the people there got discouraged by this because the deliverance of that man caused some farmers some grief. Now, obviously, they were Gentile farmers. They were raising pea-meal bacon. And all of a sudden, their pigs leaped into the sea. They begged Jesus, get out of here before you salvage some more lives. Isn't that just like the world today? And so Jesus, it says in the next verse, that now he arrived back again. So he's crossed the Sea of Galilee back into the area known as Galilee. I want to mention this very quickly. During the time when Jesus was ministering, there were three distinct areas that are mentioned. The area of the Gadarenes, that was sort of on the side, but there were three distinct areas. There was Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. You check this out. Every time that it says Jesus went to Judea, it says, and he went up to Judea. But every time that Jesus went to Samaria, it says, and Jesus went down to Samaria. Up to Judea, down to Samaria. But when it says he went into Galilee, it just says, and Jesus went into Galilee. I want to remind you of this, that up in Judea, he was repelled. They were smarter than him. They were righteous. Judea was the home of Jerusalem. It was the place where David had celebrated the Lord. It was the place of higher learning. It was where the temple had been built and where sacrifices had been given to the Lord. So if you were from Judea, you were definitely from Ontario. If you're from Alberta, well, you know the rest of the story. That was supposed to be funny. I lived in Alberta. They really feel like outcasts, and as of right now, even the more. And so the people down in Samaria, however, they wouldn't listen to Jesus. Remember, Jesus went to a well and spoke to a woman at the well of Samaria, and she didn't reject him, but she inasmuch as said, why are you talking to me? Have you lost your way? Have you forgotten where you are? I'm down here in Samaria. The people up in Judea reject us and they want nothing to do with us. They consider us to be less than dogs. To the woman in Samaria, he basically said, come on up. To the people up in Judea, he said, you better come down. But the people in Galilee, they responded favorably. I want to remind you of something else about this Galilee. It was prayed in the back room before I came out here by a certain minstrel that, Lord, help Brother David to go down a rabbit hole. We're going down there right now. So I never intended to share this with you. But in Galilee, they were people who believed. Up in Judea, they wanted to know, think about this, the bread and the fishes. If Jesus had tried and do bread and fishes up in Judea, guess what the people would have asked? Is it kosher? If Jesus had tried to meet the needs of the people down in Samaria, they would have said, what's he up to? But in Galilee, a few elements of fish, a few crusts of bread, they saw what he had in his hand. Thousands were sitting there. You think about it. What's the big miracle when Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish? It sounds like I just asked a rhetorical question. The bread and the fish. Is that the big miracle? I say, nay, nay. The big miracle was when Jesus held up a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish and said, dinner is served. They sat down. and prepared to eat. That is faith. So do you live up in Judea? You live it down in Samaria. I invite you to meet us and Jesus in the Galilee. So Jesus is on his way back to Galilee by boat. And it came to pass that when Jesus had returned, the people gladly received him, for they were all waiting for him on the seashore. But there was a huge crowd. We know that. We're going to see it in moments. Huge crowd. And behold, there came a man named Jairus. And he's identified as a ruler of the synagogue. That means he was high up. Probably, maybe from Judea. We're uncertain of that. If he's a ruler of the synagogue, he's pretty high up there in the echelon. And he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought him, please come to my house. I want to mention right here that the first person that got to Jesus among the thousands is this man. Without a doubt, people saw him, and although the crowd was tremendous, they got out of this man's way. He got to be the first in line to address Jesus. Thousands wanted Jesus' attention, but this guy got Jesus' attention. He only had one daughter, 12 years of age, and she was dying. But as he went, the people thronged him. What it leaves out here is that Jesus was responding, and you have to read that into it. The man, Jairus, begs Jesus, my daughter's dying, please come. And the next words were, and as he went, the people thronged him. So Jesus is making his way towards the house of Jairus. And it was almost impossible for him to make a move. Crowd, huge crowd. He can hardly move. And a woman who had an issue of blood lasting 12 years, hemorrhaging, she spent all of her money on physicians, but none could help her. This woman came behind him and touched the border of his garment, and immediately that hemorrhaging ceased. Jesus turned and said, who just touched me? Get a picture. Thousands around pushing and shoving. Women clearly had been reaching out. Men reaching out. A man maybe holding a very sick child, reaching out and trying to get a hold of Jesus' arm. Trying to get his attention. My baby, my baby. Thousands trying to get his attention. Thousands touching him at one moment or another. And the master turns and says, wait a minute. Somebody just touched me. Peter says, Master, the crowd is so big. They're all pressing you. And you ask this question of us? Anybody know who touched me? And Jesus replies, no. Somebody touched me. For I perceive that virtue, healing power, just went out of me. I get thrilled when I read that. When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, falling down before him. Why is she trembling? And why did she drop down before him? You might say, well, I think she would drop down before him because she realized he had such glorious authority. She touched him and suddenly virtue flowed out of him. He's a man of authority. You better be careful. He's calling on you and you better respond appropriately. So she declares to him, and she says so out loud, so lots of people heard her, the reason that she had touched him. And she mentions that she was immediately healed. And Jesus said unto her, daughter, wow. He calls her daughter. That's a loving term. I want to drill down on that in a moment. That Jesus spoke a loving term. of all the thousands that were there, he spoke lovingly to her. And he cheered her. He said, you be comfortable. Why did he tell her, don't worry, settle down. Don't worry, you're not going to be chastised. Don't worry, no harm is going to come your way. Don't be afraid, honey. Don't be afraid. Your faith has made you whole. He said so many uplifting words at this moment. Daughter, it's okay. It was your faith that made you whole. Now you go in peace. I've been studying this. I know it's a simple story and we've all heard it, but to me there's always 13 stories behind the story. And with my imagination, I start seeing things that I think are there, but they're not obvious. I hear the hinges on a door making a rather screeching sound, an uncomfortable sound. I see a little child calling out, Mommy, where are you going? This child had to be at least 13 years of age. She'd been in trouble for at least 12. She had a hemorrhaging problem. You're not going to give birth during that time. I see a child, it's not mentioned here, bear with me. He hears the door. He sits up, it's barely sunrise. Mom, where are you going? She was trying to just sneak away on her own. I see her turning and saying, you go back to sleep. Mom has to go somewhere. But he knows Mom is faint. He knows she's weak. He knows she's pale in color. She's hemorrhaging. She's a mess. Where would she be going this time of the day? The shops aren't open. Why is she going? Where is she going? Mom, please don't go. I have to go. Why? Because there's another doctor and I got to see him. But Mom, you've wasted all your money on doctors to no avail. And Mom, you don't have any money. And she replies, I've heard about a doctor that charges no fees. And everyone to whom he gives attention is wonderfully healed. I've got to get to him. The little fellow might start assessing and saying, but there's going to be a huge crowd if he can do that. How are you going to get to him, Mom? The child is thinking, you haven't got the strength to work through the crowd. The crowd are going to be pushing and shoving, doctor, 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 or whatever they might call this great physician. But she replies, Mommy has a plan. She's not Judean. She wasn't worried about kosher. She was not Samaritan, feeling she wasn't worthy. She was a Galilean. She was the kind of person that when Jesus held up a little bit of fragment of food, she would have sat down expecting to receive. Mommy had a plan. Leviticus chapter 15. If a woman has a flow of blood for many days that is unrelated to menstrual period. I'm sorry, this is a delicate topic. It's in the Word. I got to deal with it. It's got everything, what I'm reading right now, it's got everything to do with why she trembled. Everything to do with why she dropped on her knees. Everything to do with why she said, it's okay, it's okay. Everything to do with why he said, it's your faith. God has honored you today. God honored a woman who by common consideration up in Judea was not worthy. Get away, woman, get away. A woman who has a flow of blood unrelated to her period, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she's ceremonially unclean. as during the menstrual period, the woman will be unclean as long as the discharge continues. That passage goes on and on and on about what has to happen. Everything that she touches, she being ceremonially unclean, everything she touches becomes unclean. Every person she touches becomes unworthy of God's blessing. You say, why was the word of God so harsh? God was trying to make a point. The law of the Old Testament was a schoolmaster teaching us, don't come haphazardly into the presence of God. Your sins for sure will find you out. Sin is not tolerated in His presence. What's that got to do with a lady's period? Nothing at all. But God laid all these rules and said, this maybe will help you to understand. You come to my presence, you come clean. If the blood issuing ceased, she had to continue her absence from public for at least 7 days. If she touched anyone, if anyone touched her, if anyone touched something that she had touched, that which she had touched became unclean. You touch it, you are unclean. Unclean means what? You must not go to the sanctuary. You must not go and worship. You might be in the midst of a throng, in the midst of thousands, and whoever you touch has been made unclean. God forbid you'd get near a holy man. God forbid you'd get near a man who speaks the word of God. God forbid that you would get near, would this Jesus dare be the Messiah? Then don't you be caught sullying him. You touch him and you make him as sick as you. Because you are unclean, whatever you touch is unclean. If you sit on a chair, dear lady, that chair is filthy. No one is allowed to sit on it. But she touched him. She believed that when she touched him, he would not become unclean. She had faith to believe if she touched him, the whole thing would be reversed. She would become clean. First Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 22. If anybody does not love the Lord, let him live under a curse. If anybody doesn't love the Lord, he's living under a curse. Do you love the Lord? This is not an Old Testament thing. This is the Apostle Paul. If you don't love Jesus, there's a curse hanging over you. Wait. You have an issue of blood, lady? There's a curse hanging over you. Whatever you touch is cursed. You are cursed. 12 years you've been unclean. I found my father-in-law many years ago. April's daddy, stepdad, arrived at his house. He lived in the same city that we lived in at the time. I found him sitting at the kitchen table crying. That was a strange sight. Just because I'd never seen this before. He'd obviously been there for hours, had his Bible open. His face was all swollen, his eyes puffy. I said, Harold, what's happening? I'm doomed. I'm cursed. Harold, what are you talking about? I'm not well, David. I'm not well. And there's a preacher on television who says, speak the word of faith and you'll be healed. I've spoken the word of faith. I can't get healed. He went on to say, if you don't get your miracle, something's wrong. Sin gets in the way. He said, David, I'm cursed. I'm cursed. I said, Harold, that man on the television, whoever he is, I said, he's a poached egg that cannot be backed up by the word of God. Who does he think he is? A Pharisee? Because you see, this woman was being treated as being cursed. Well, Pastor, the Levitical law said if you're unclean. Yes, if it said you're unclean, dear lady, stay out of the way. Don't sell to anybody else. But you see, this lady lived under a horrendous curse. Here she comes. She's coming to the baker's place. Don't touch the same doorknob. What's wrong with her? Why did she come out among us? Stay away from her. Stay away from her. Don't go near her. Don't go near her. She's cursed. This woman lived under an affliction. This woman experienced the scourge of righteous humanity. Scourge is a word that speaks of taking a harsh rod or a whip, scourging. They scourged Jesus before they put him on the cross. Discouragement is related. Discouragement is a put down, the opposite to encourage. This woman was discouraged. This woman had lost all sense of dignity, 12 years, and no answer. 12 years, and she was being held in contempt by her neighbors and everyone who knew her. 12 years, you can't keep your secret forever. But she came to the right doctor. Isaiah 53, he is despised and rejected of men. He's a man of sorrows, and he's acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. As he started to come, we turned our backs on him. The Pharisees despised him. They spat on him. When he was dragging the cross up to Golgotha, the women cleared their throat and spat on him. Despised, rejected. They hid their faces from him. Isaiah 53, speaking of Jesus coming, says, he was despised, and we gave him no esteem whatsoever. Despised. You are defective. You are a loser. You are rejected. I read it again to you, Isaiah 53. The question of the prophet. Who has believed our message? Can I just remind you of something? This is just a rabbit hole. I've shared this with you before, and I don't know if you caught on to it. But so much of the Old Testament is actually poetry, Hebrew poetry. And here's how Hebrew poetry works. There will be a statement, and then there will be a statement that is secondary. But the secondary statement actually magnifies, embellishes, show forth the value of what the first statement was. Somebody might say, that's a lovely flower. And another one might add, that's the most beautiful flower I've ever seen in my life. That would be like Hebrew poetry. The first statement is embellished and blessed, lifted up, and expounded upon by the second. Listen close. Who has believed our message? Who is the our message? It's Isaiah who got a message from the Lord. It was known as Isaiah's message, but it was known as the Lord's message. Our message. Who has believed our message? And then the expounding of it. The second line was, who has the arm of the Lord been revealed? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So you see, that's embellishing the first. Who believes the message? The second one, the second line is, who has any spiritual understanding? Who's even catching on? Has anyone experienced a revelation of the Lord's arm? Verse 2, he grew up before him, that's the Father, like a tender shoot. It's embellished. He grew up like a root out of dry ground. So the first line just says he was like a tender little shoot. But the second line says, yeah, and out of dry, harsh ground. Goes on. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. No beauty, no majesty, nothing to make us pursue him. Second line, nothing in his appearance that we would desire him. Verse 3, he was despised and he was rejected by mankind. A man, the second line, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces. The second line, despised. And we held him in low regard. The fourth verse, surely he took our pain and he bore our suffering. It's not obvious, but when you pause and just look at it, a woman that everybody despised, a woman that didn't have a friend, a woman that nobody believed in. She walked into a store, the store would clear out. She's got an issue of blood. God is punishing her for something. I don't want to get near her. I like this. The crowd was so powerful and so crushing that Jesus could hardly move. He's trying to get to the house of Jairus. A girl's dying. He can hardly move for the crush of the crowd. So I see him going slower and slower. Have you ever been in a crowd like that where you can hardly move? It can happen. The woman could not have caught up to them if he was walking even 1 mile an hour. She could not have kept up with any kind of pace. But because the crowd was stymied, she had an opportunity. I submit to you. It's not in the text. I submit to you. She went on all fours. Because on all fours, she would not be jostled by the crowd, which would wear her out completely. She had no energy. I see her on her hands and knees going between the legs that she had to navigate until finally she got close enough. And Mark's gospel tells us of this same story. She believed that if she could just touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. It was the huge crowd that made it possible for the reject to get to Jesus. And the moment she touched him, he turned and said, "Who touched me?" His friend said, "Jesus, surely you're making a joke." Everybody's touching you. Everybody's grasping. Everybody's touching you. Shoulders are hitting you. People are grasping and tugging at you, trying to get your attention. But one touched him who was not grabbing. One touched him who was not looking for attention. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be known. She wanted to move in, get her healing, and disappear. Because you see, she was a reject. And nobody would know on the moment, on the spot, that she was healed. She wanted to arrive incognito. She made it. She touched him. And Jesus said, "Somebody touched me. I felt healing go out of me. Where are you? Show me who you are. We're not going anywhere. We're not making another move until I find out who you are." And this woman realizes she's got to acknowledge. So she scrambles to her feet and says, "It is I, sir." But she drops on her knees and she's trembling. She's afraid. You see, if it's believed that she just made him unclean, there would be people who would stone her on the spot. They would kill her right now. So she's afraid. But what does Jesus call her? Now, he's not saying, "You are my daughter." He's saying a loving term. He's calling her honey. He's calling her dearie. Daughter, it's all right. Be comforted. And by the way, you remember that I said this. It was your faith that issued the miracle. Check this out. Check this out. Until this story in Luke's gospel, until this story, you will read these words. When he was in Galilee, watch it, don't miss this. Everyone that Jesus touched was made whole. After this story, you will read this word. Everyone who touched him received a miracle. This reject, this loser, this woman who everyone said, you're under a curse, she set the bar higher. She made it known. She touched him and she was made whole. She started a revival of divine healing. And I hasten to remind you, she was a Galilean. What's the value of this to you and I today? Well, I choose to end today as I like always to end. You've noticed I love to end and end and end. I want to tell you a story about a man whose name I don't even know to this day. I did hear it on one occasion, and I lost the name. It doesn't matter. You will identify with the story. I was in a city called Longview, Washington. That's the state of Washington. Maybe I'm guessing an hour outside of Seattle, Longview, Washington. I had an acquaintance with a pastor. There's a reason for that I knew him. I phoned him. My board graciously, when there was a general conference coming up, and they said, you want to go to the conference, we'll pay your way. And I said, would you be gracious to me? I've heard a couple of things that are happening in the States, and I'd like to get there. Where do you want to go? Have you seen the story of the Jesus Revolution on the TV or somewhere? It was that guy. I said, I got to get there. Because it was on Look magazine or Time, whatever. It was a huge story. Young people, the rejects, the flower children, the idiots were getting saved and getting baptized by the 100 in the Pacific Ocean. And here's this humble preacher that's being used of God. I said, I got to get there. I got to see it. And then I want to get up to Longview, Washington, because I know of a pastor there. I'd like to kind of see how he's functioning there. We were on the cusp of a move of God. I sensed it in my spirit. God gave me a promise out of the book of Habakkuk. I knew that I knew that I knew, and I wanted to get ready. I believed there was a new baby to be born, and I wanted to prepare the nursery. The board was so gracious, they said, David, we trust you, you go. I went to California's first. I took in the revival that was happening under Pastor Chuck Smith. Never got to meet him. The throng was too great. And then I went up to Longview, Washington, and there I was the guest of a man who will just be Pastor David. He was so kind, so generous, like to a fault. And I said, look, I'm here. I want to learn everything that I can. You order my day. Well, he gave me several little things that I was to. And one of those stories I believe I already told you, but I'm going to tell you one I haven't told you as of yet. Same situation, same city. He said there's a brand new small group that it's happening tonight. And I want you to go there. Now, by the way, he said, these are all reasonably newcomers to our assembly. And so this is their very first meeting as a group. So he said, don't feel strange. Outsider. He said, everybody's new. So just go. And he said, I think you'll appreciate what happened. Well, I went and showed up at this home. I was the first person to arrive. I went in. I was very, very impressed with the man and his wife who were the host and host. They made me feel like so special. Sit anywhere you want. The room was set up. Their living room was set up in a circle. They were expecting maybe 12 people. That's probably how many arrived. People were coming over, shaking my hand, whatever. And I'm just kind of taking it all in. I'm thinking, well, this is an interesting thing. A man came through the door, And this guy, I just thought in my head, I wouldn't want to cross that guy. This guy had several days of growth on his face. Nothing wrong with that. It's okay, Zatursky. You look just fine. I'm not afraid of you. But he had a very unkept facial beard. Secondly, his face was like he was a survivor of the Vietnam War. He had deep crevices. It was just the design of his face. It was in his, his genomes or whatever makes us who we are. His hair was wiry. He had a mustache. It was all wiry. I looked at him. His hands were kind of greasy and dirty, which meant he works with his hand. Stay clear of the hands, Dave. This guy's a tough guy. I had him figured out. The host and hostess took turns in sharing, how's the evening going to go? You're all new to this, so we just want you to get acquainted. Here's how we're going to go. We're going to go around the circle, and we're inviting each and every one of us to please tell us your name. And then we want you to tell us where in your childhood was your favorite place in your house. My mind went speedily ahead, and I was ready to tell my story. You're dying to know my favorite spot in the house. Say yes. Nobody wants to know. Okay. No, it was the basement of our house, and my brother and I went down there, and we would build a fort from some furniture, an old rug or whatever, and we'd get inside the dark, and there we were in our fortress. Kind of a nutty thing. Little kids acting out. That was my favorite place in the house. I went down there every evening with my brother. I heard a man say, my favorite place was not in the house, it was out in the garage. My dad was a tinkerer. I loved to be with my dad. He could fix anything. He could make anything with wood. He could do all kinds of stuff. I learned a lot of stuff from my dad. One of the ladies said, my favorite place in the house, as I recall, was in the kitchen with my mom. She was a great cook, and she could make pastry. I learned so much from my mom. One lady spoke up and said, well, I'll tell you where my favorite place was in the house, in the bathroom. Oxygen left the room. We thought, where's this going? She said, it was the only safe place in my house. I had two brothers that were brats, and they drove me nuts. Just tantalizing, teasing. I got into the bathroom, I could turn. She said, I'd just sit there and read a book, or I'd have myself a bubble bath as a little kid, and nobody could chase me out. My brothers were held at bay. I told my little part, and then it came around to, the lumberjack, the tough guy. He started off with, I'd love to say my favorite place was in the garage where my dad was. But he said, no, my dad didn't spend any time in the garage. He said, my mom never really had opportunity to be a great cook, and I wouldn't have spent time there anywhere. And he paused. You could tell. This guy's feeling really awkward. He said, I don't know what you're going to think about this. But he said, I know it's strange. My favorite place when I was a little kid was under the house. Oh. He said, you see, my dad was an alcoholic. He said, my dad drank himself into a stupor every night. He was hopelessly buried in his booze. My mom wasn't much different from him. And when my dad got drunk, he got mean. He would slap my mom. She'd go careening across the room, crashing over furniture, crying and screaming back, you leave me alone. And he called her unspeakable, horrible words. And he said, I'd learned at a very early age, don't get in his way. He has no use for you either. He said, I lived in fear. I was terrorized. There was no place in that house where I was safe. In his stupor, he would find me. One day out in the yard, I poked my way in behind a lilac bush, and I discovered something that I didn't know. Unlike some of the other houses in the area, our house did not have a basement. He said our house was propped up on some kind of stilts, and he said there were boards all around the skirt. But he said there was a board that was loose. I pried and I tugged, and I got it loose. Then I pulled on another one, and I got it loose. I crawled underneath, and he said, wow, what a place. A gigantic cave. And I'm the only one that knows where it is. The day came, he said, when my mom tossed a blanket to the side and said, well, that's too old. I'm going to put that in the trash next week. He said, I knew she wouldn't miss it. He said, when nobody's looking, I took the blanket and I stored it under the house. I was speechless. If I'd had to say a word right then, I think I would have begged an apology and say, sir, I had you all wrong. I jumped to conclusions. I judged you without even hardly hearing your voice. I judged you by what you look like. I judged you by your beard and by the grease under your fingernails. I judged you by the crags in your face, or just something that probably you inherited from your family. I owe you an apology. This man went on to say that when things started to get ruckus, and he knew that he could sneak out without being noticed, he'd say, out that screen door at the back. He said, I did this in the winter too. He said, it was cold under there, but I had my blanket. And there was no wind under there, just a couple of boards were missing. He said, my favorite place in my house was under the house. He was considered by his mom and his dad as a loser. He had a sense of awkwardness when everybody was telling the wonderful opportunities, the wonderful places, the wonderful things that they had experienced in childhood, and not him. And then I won't go into any detail, maybe Maury Blair, my old buddy, maybe he was here at some time. I wouldn't doubt. I think he's been in every church in Canada. Maury was raised by a drunken man who was not his father. His father referred to him because he was not sired by this man. This was sort of like a second non-marriage. His first dad had abandoned his mom, and this man showed up. This man was a continuous drunk, and he beat Maury within the edge of his life. He tried to kill him on one occasion. When Maury was born, the story is that his mom knew that there was not a safe place. She put him in a cardboard box and put him out in the garden, hoping that the frost would kill him. That would be a better way than for him to live in this house. Thankfully, her sister, his auntie, came by, and the story was related to him later. I heard you crying, honey, and I brought the box in and said to my sister, what are you trying to do? This man beat him. He was not allowed to eat at their supper table. The heat for the upstairs was through a steel grate, and the kitchen table was right below the grate. One of his brothers would come up and hand him a plate of food. He was not allowed to eat with the family. You're a black bastard. You don't belong in this house. He would sit looking through the grate, and he would eat his supper, pretending he was at the table with his family. Maury met Jesus in an astounding way. It'd be better for him to tell you the story. Maury has traveled all over Canada, all over the United States. He's a trophy of mercy and grace. He's been interviewed by some of the top psychologists in the U.S. and Canada, and absolutely every one of them said, the story that you relate to us, Maury, you should have been in prison. You should have been a murderer, because whoever abuses becomes an abuser. That is a law like gravity. Maury Blair, my buddy, has written this book, Child of Woe. I've helped finance him with that. He's written a book. He's never sold a copy. He's given away thousands. He'll walk into Tim Hortons and see somebody sitting, having a coffee. He walks up and he says, do you read much? And if the person says yes, he says, I wrote this book. It's my story. If you ever want to get in touch with me, my address is in the back. Murray gets phone calls from Africa. Murray gets emails. He gets messages from all over the world. He's a man who dared to touch Jesus, and it changed his life forever. I think he just had his 82nd birthday. He's a very old man. He's my buddy. I love him with all my heart. He's a trophy of grace. Wherever you were raised, whatever your history in the past, does not define who you are in the future if you dare to touch Jesus. If you dare to touch Jesus, he cancels all that feeling of rejection and sorrow. He was the man of sorrow for you. He was the man who was rejected so that you can't say to him, you have no idea. He knows. He's the one who cares and understands. He said these words, come unto me, all you who have been abused and hurt and your hearts are heavy. Come to me. I'll give you rest from all of that. There's nobody like Jesus. He's my Jesus. Is he your Jesus? Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, thank you for helping me this morning to open up the burden of my heart. And Lord, I don't know who in this audience, an extended audience who chime in on YouTube or whatever means. I have no idea, Lord, but you know absolutely every one of us. Jesus, somebody today needs to touch you. The promise comes about like this, as many as touched him. Jesus, we know that Jesus says, come. If we don't come, if we don't go, if we don't reach out, we needn't bother expect something special from you. We've got to come. We've got to go to the bank and cash that check. We've got to go to the doctor and get that prescription. We've got to go somewhere if we expect. And Jesus, I pray whoever needs to go to you right now, that they will dare to go to you and they will dare to touch you. The Pharisees up in Judea want no part of Jesus. The people down in Samaria say, I'm not worthy, don't come and see me. But I thank God for all the people of Galilee, when invited to sit down because lunch was to be served, had faith to sit down. Jesus, help me with my unbelief, someone cried out to him. Help those who would say, I don't have faith. Jesus, help us to understand. Just say, Jesus, I need you. And that is faith. I ask for this mercy today in the name of Jesus. And everyone dared to say,